Okay, we're going to start our plaster demo and I'm going to show you what you need. First of all is a bucket of water because that is where you wash your hands. You never ever ever wash your hands in the sink. You never pour any plaster down the sink at all. Otherwise you're going to have a big plumber's bill as they have to tear out all of your plumbing. So only wash your hands in a bucket of water and then you can throw that somewhere outside. Next, we have the objects that we're going to mold. And for example, you see this duck here. I have divided it in half where you see this is where there'll be no overhangs as you dip it into the plaster. So you have to divide your object in half. It's best to put kind of a mark on there. And I've also got this skull here. You can actually, well, you'll see a bit later where I marked it. It's kind of hard to see on there, but it's a seam down the middle where you're going to cover the face entirely with plaster and the back of the head. And you have to sort of imagine that your object is embedded in plaster, and how are you going to get it out of the plaster once the plaster has hardened. Okay. And then you also need a paintbrush because you're going to have to paint everything with Vaseline, including the rubber duck and the insides of the bowl that you're going to be putting the mold in. There's your Vaseline, although it's just more properly petroleum jelly. There's some Play-Doh, which you could either make objects out of, or specifically I'm going to make a dividing line with those. Here we have plaster of Paris. There's a lot of different types of plaster you can use, and we normally use a different plaster in school. But plaster of Paris is readily available at places like Canadian Tire. And I'll repeat it again, but it's a mixture of 2 parts water to 2 parts plaster to 1 part water. 2 plaster, 1 water. Here's your different containers. The containers where you're going to make the mold. There's one there, and there's another one there. And here's your bucket of water that you use actually as part of the process when you're mixing. Okay, that's all of your stuff, and then now I'm going to get going. I'm first going to do a 2-part mold where I fill one of the containers with plaster, and then I dip the duck into it. And the second one, I'm going to actually build a mold around this skull, and it shows you how to create a plaster mold without a container, or one that wouldn't fit into a container. Okay, let's go. Now we'll start with the first things first. Make yourself a little bit of room where you're going to be working. These are the containers that I actually measure the water and the plaster in, and use separate containers but equal containers to do the water and the plaster. Here's my duck that I'm going to make the mold of, and there's the water. Have everything organized around you, and here is the plaster. Okay, the first thing that you do is, and you want to do this before you start because you don't really have time once you start mixing the plaster. So you have to coat your container where you're going to put the plaster. Coat it entirely on the inside with Vaseline, because if you don't, you won't be able to get the plaster out. Now, if you're going to mold any part of your body, which I don't necessarily recommend, but some people want to do it, you absolutely must cover every millimeter of what's going to be cast in Vaseline. Otherwise, you'll have to go to the hospital for them to get the mold off. Okay, when that's nice and coated, then the next thing you do is your rubber duck, or whatever you're going to use. And you might as well do almost all of it, but at least you have to do the first half, the part that's going to be submerged in the plaster. And don't be afraid to put too much, although smooth it out well so that you can get it out. And I'll mention it now, and I'll mention it again, that once you make your first layer of plaster and then you pour the other plaster over top, you absolutely have to put Vaseline between the two layers. Otherwise, you'll never get them apart. Okay, now we have to kind of guess how much plaster we're going to make. And I figure it's about 2/3 of one of these containers of water. You always put the water first when you're mixing plaster. You never pour the water into the plaster. It's always the plaster into the water. And that might be a little bit too much, but it doesn't really matter here. And you have to make sure you get your measurements fairly exact, but if you're going to go overboard, perhaps put a little bit too much plaster, and it's going to be a mess, by the way. If you don't put enough plaster, it won't harden properly, and if you put too much plaster, like way too much, it'll become very crumbly. Now, one thing to know about plaster is it doesn't dry, it actually hardens. So it's a little bit almost like a resin in that you get a chemical reaction happening. And that's important to know because at first your plaster is going to take quite a while to start hardening. And then once it does start to harden, it's going to harden very, very quickly. And what you need to do is, as you mix it up, I should have actually used a bit of a bigger bowl here. Normally you'd mix it in something larger, but I figured this one would be okay just to mix it in here. Again, 2 parts plaster to 1 part water. And you have to mix it so that you get absolutely all of the lumps out of there. Okay, and once all the lumps are out, the plaster should be thick enough that as soon as you dip your finger in, it's actually very, very nicely coated with an even coat. Anything less than that means it's too watery. And then once it is actually properly mixed, you just insert the duck. And you're going to have to hold it there for a period of time. And there's one thing about doing mold making is you actually have a lot of hurry up and wait. So I probably could have mixed a little bit less than this, but it's not so bad. And then you just place your duck in there exactly halfway to that line and as close as you can to the middle of the container. And you have to hold it until it begins to set. So this is where the hurry up and wait comes. And then once you wash your hands off, again, remember that you wash them in the bucket. And once more, I could say that you wear your oldest clothing because you're going to get a lot of plaster on them and it's going to get quite messy. Now, the warmer the water, the faster it's going to set. And you can get different types of plaster that set very, very quickly. And you can get other types of plaster that take hours to set. And if you make a mixture that's fairly rich, like slightly over the amount of plaster, again, I wouldn't recommend it, but if you go a little bit over, it'll set a little bit faster. So you just hold it until it's pretty well set. It takes about 6 minutes to start setting, and it takes about half an hour to harden. And then once it begins to set, and I'll do a close-up of this in a minute, you actually put a couple of little divots in there. And the divots are so that you can align the two pieces of the mold after you take it apart. Now with the skull, I've gotten a little bit of a head start. I took some of the excess plaster from the duck and I poured it in there. And you can see what I did here is I built kind of a halo or a dividing wall exactly on halfway around the skull. And where I had the line in there, I actually then put this is made out of Play-Doh. Plasticine is probably the best. And I put a little bit of plaster in the bottom just to kind of stabilize it. before I go on to the next stage. And then what I'll do in the next stage is I'll make sure this is again all covered with Vaseline. It has to be totally covered with Vaseline. And then I will kind of throw plaster onto this side of it. I'll show you what I'm doing there. And then once it is hardened, then I will take those strips off and I'll put plaster on the other side. Okay, I just have to wait for the plaster to harden a little bit more and then we'll continue. Okay, here I have my duck sitting in the somewhat hardened plaster, and you can see the little divots I made. Those are so the two halves will register. Now before you do the next layer, what you need to do is clean off all the little bits of plaster in there and clean all the little bits of plaster around the edge of this so that the two halves don't stick. And then you have to cover everything again with Vaseline, and particularly the duck and particularly every square millimeter of the plaster, otherwise you won't get them apart. And again, with the skull here, I'm now going to build up a layer of plaster on the skull and up to the edge of this halo. Right here with this plaster, I will not put Vaseline on this because I want the two layers to stick together. But I will put Vaseline on everything else, including the other side. Now you can see the duck entirely covered with plaster, and you can see that I put a little plug here. It's made out of purple Play-Doh. And the reason for that is that when you pour the plaster in there and you cover up the duck, this plug here is going to create a channel where you could pour whatever you're going to mold, whether it's chocolate or wax or more plaster. And that when you separate the two halves, you will then take that plug out and it'll give you a spout where to pour the mixture. And you can see again that I covered the entire skull with Vaseline. You can't really see too well, and but I did not put any on the other plaster because I want that to stick together. So now I'm going to mix another mixture of plaster. I'm going to put it in a larger bowl because I want to mix more, and I'm going to do both one half of the duck and I will do the front half of the skull at the same time from the same mixture. Okay, once again I'm going to use a little bit more plaster here. I'm going to use 1 container of water and then 2 containers of plaster. And again, remember to use different containers for both the plaster and the water. So sift the plaster in there. Don't just dump it in because it mixes a little bit easier when you sift it in there. And once again, make sure you get rid of all the lumps. It's a little bit like making good gravy. You don't want any lumps in it. And remember once again to never wash your hands in the sink. Any of that plaster then would clog up your sink and they'll have to tear all the pipes out. Because like I mentioned before, plaster doesn't dry, it hardens. It's a chemical reaction, and once it hardens, it'll still harden inside your sink even if there is water moving through it. So when you've mixed it thoroughly, what you can do is pour a little bit onto the duck, and then you take more of the plaster and start pouring it against the skull. And at one point you'll have to wait for the plaster to start to harden so you can start building it up against the skull. And it's the same thing with the duck. You may have to mix a little bit more to put on top. And so you'll pour some in and then you'll do some hand forming. And if you see any spots without Vaseline on them, make sure you put some more in there. So now the duck is almost covered, and then after it starts to set a bit, I will build a mound on top. Now you can start pouring the plaster on top of this. And you want to get it into all the little cracks when it's still quite wet. And now you have to spend a little bit of time waiting for the plaster to just begin to set a little bit. So you need to wait about 5 or 10 minutes for that. So now as it starts to stiffen up a little bit, you start to build up the plaster on the head. You make sure that you get it into all the little crevices. And you also want to build it up against the plasticine. At the same time, you can start building the plaster up over top of the duck. And eventually you build a little mound. Now I just mixed up a little bit more plaster to go with it. And this is a little bit of the plaster, the mold making, that takes a little bit of time and patience. But you have to be diligent because then it can start to harden very quickly. So I'm doing this one only as a 2-part mold, but if you have a very complex shape that you're making, you can make this as a 3 or a 4-part mold. You can make it as a 20-part mold. It's all okay. You can see it's just starting to stiffen up a little bit. So now you can actually apply it kind of up on the skull. And you want it to be about 2 centimeters thick. Now, plaster will start to heat up as it begins to harden. So if you're doing a mold on yourself, you have to take that into account, that it might get really hot. Now, there are other ways of doing this. You can also do this with plaster bandages. And if you're going to do a mold on yourself, it's probably a good idea to use a plaster bandage. This is where it gets really, really, really messy. And at the same time, you can build it up on the duck. And again, on the duck, you want it to be about 2 centimeters thick. So that one looks like it'll be pretty well just about set there. And as it begins to set, you can start taking some of the plaster that has fallen off from around. Make sure you keep this clean on the other half, but you can still clean that off a bit. Now it's starting to get really nice and kind of creamy. Put a little bit more on there. Okay, that one will be ready to go. So it's a little bit like making a cake with your hands. Then you want to fill it up right to the edge, but don't go over the edge of the Play-Doh because that was just about the right thickness. This type of mold is actually quite easy to do. This one is a lot more difficult and it takes a little bit of practice. And you have to have a lot of patience again to grab the plaster while it is hardening. So you keep smoothing it up. Now, a lot of people take great pride in doing extremely neat molds, and I think really neat molds look better. But the outside, as long as it's properly covered, doesn't really matter how smooth or neat it is. You just have to make sure it's thick enough. And you might as well scrape it off your hands so that your hands don't get encased. Make sure you cover your table. There we go. That is half the mold done. Okay, these two are ready to go. Now we just have to wait for them to harden. So I'll be back in about half an hour I won't leave the camera running, so don't worry about that. Here you can see the mold of the skull half done. And when the plaster is hard enough, we will remove the green and the purple strips. And then the next layer of plaster goes against that. And remember again that you have to thoroughly cover the other half of the mold with Vaseline. Where you take off the green and the purple, that has to be very, very thoroughly covered with Vaseline, or you won't get the two halves apart. And there's the other one. It just looks like a cake ready to go. You leave that for at least an hour before you pull apart the two halves to make sure that the plaster sets to some degree. So now you start to take off the Play-Doh. Now is when you start to put Vaseline over the entire, every little bit of it. Okay, you can see now how this is completely covered with Vaseline. And the next thing to do is to mix up some more plaster. So we use 1 container of water again and 2 containers of plaster. Remember to kind of sprinkle it in there. And then once again we mix it up so that there's no lumps. Now always make sure that you put the right amount of plaster in, because once you start to mix it, you cannot add water. That's one of the aspects of plaster, is you have to, if you go a little bit over, it's okay, but that's why you have to measure things quite carefully. And so what we're going to do is fill up around here so that it is just, it doesn't overlap, but it just fills it up to this where we took out off the wall that was there. And you start it off by just pouring a little bit of plaster over the face of it. Well, this would be the back of the head. So you can, now you can tilt it a little bit and you can pour some plaster on it. Oh, spilled some there. Don't want to really do that. Well, we'll scoop that up later. Now you have to let it set a little bit before you continue. So you put that to the side to some degree and let it set. And then you might want to just wash your hands off a little bit for the next. And you can open up the other mold. It's been sitting there for about an hour. So I've already loosened it up a little bit. And you should be able to take it out. And then if you can't get them apart easily, you can actually take a hammer and very, very carefully separate this. But because I did it properly, the mold comes apart quite easily. And you see where the plug was there? You can take that out. You may have to carve away a little bit of plaster that got in there. And so here you can see the two-part mold, and you see where I put the divots right there. It made these little bumps here. So it fits together very, very easily. And you see that's where you're going to pour your material. Now, you have to let it set overnight before you pour anything in there. And you're going to want to wash the plasticine out, and then whatever you take out of here, you see, you throw it away. Don't use it for anything else because it's got bits of plaster. Now, if you're using clay to do this, and a lot of times people use clay, absolutely throw that clay away. If you then make something out of it and you put it into, the kiln or something, it will explode. So you have to make sure that absolutely no plaster gets into your clay if you're going to fire it. So the duck fits in there pretty nicely. Okay, and then you just put this to the side and you let it harden. And then you wait for the plaster to set a little bit so that you can start pouring it on. But you can take little bits of plaster and kind of fill in the holes there. And you can tilt this because the other side is already done and it's a little bit stable. Except, of course, it ends up pouring plaster out, so you got to be careful with that. Okay, let it set a little bit more. Now that you've got the surface kind of covered, let it set, and then we will come back and finish it off. Let it set for about maybe 5 more minutes. So you take your plaster and you smooth the rest of it on there. Here you can see it. And make sure that you don't cover up the seam here, because that's where you're going to separate them. As you can see, you make a glorious mess when you do mold making. So make sure you cover your table with all sorts of cardboard and things like that, and then promise whoever lives in the house that you're going to clean it up. Now, you can also use plaster just to make forms. You don't have to do mold making, and if you like the idea of working with plaster but you don't want to make a mold, you could try mixing it up a little bit and then just practice making forms out of it. I mean, one thing you could do is pour it into a plastic bag and let it harden, and just as it's starting to harden, you can start to form it. It's an easy way to make kind of organic shapes and things like that. And you can also dip the plaster into cloth strips and then apply it that way. It makes a very nice surface, and you can paint the surface and things like that if you like. Now I might want to add a little bit to this side. You can always add plaster to plaster. Just make sure you keep the seam clean, but if you want it to be a little bit smoother on this side. And then you may decide you just like this as it is and you don't actually want to break it in half. And then once again, let this harden for about an hour before you break it in half. And then probably these dishes, you can just soak them in water and the plaster will come off at some point. So if you happen to like something like the Great British Bake Off, you could maybe practice doing it with flour. And there's your little duck. Okay, we'll be back. Okay, let's crack this thing open. So it comes off pretty easily from the bowl. And then you go around it just a little bit, tapping until it actually kind of cracks open here. Okay, so there you can see the face. And then you work a little bit just to get the rest of it out. Oh, it broke, but this can be glued back together. Well, wait till it dries before you glue it. And you can use ordinary white carpenter's glue. That can come off. They often break. That's just something that happens, but like I say, you can glue them together or you can just tie it together. And then this is where you will actually pour the plaster or whatever you want to put in there. It can be plaster or whatever. And you can just actually even tape it together, but I would glue it before pouring anything in there. And that will be for the next demo.